The dust tasted of fear and alkali. It coated Alara's tongue, settled in the cracks of her sun-scorched skin, and veiled the horizon in a perpetual haze. Each day was a brutal echo of the last, a cycle of labor under a sky that offered no mercy and the eyes of her captors, which offered less. She was a ghost in their midst, stripped of name and past. Known only by the color of her hair, the sun was bleaching from gold to straw. Her hands, once deft with needle and thread, were raw and calloused from scraping hides and hauling wood. Her body was a map of exhaustion, her spirit a flickering ember in the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. The camp was a transient entity, a collection of teepees and animal pens that blossomed and withered with the movements of the herd and the whims of the warriors. Noise was constant, the cry of children, the chatter of women, the snorting of ponies, the guttural commands of men. And the silence, when it fell, was heavy with unspoken threat. She learned to read the subtle shifts in atmosphere, the way the wind carried voices, the tension in a shared glance. Survival hinged on becoming invisible yet hyper-aware. Among the many faces, one was different. He was called Tall Knife, though she learned this name much later, piecing it together from the rapid, liquid sounds of their language. He was not old, yet carried the weight of years in the deep lines etched around his eyes and the solemn set of his mouth. His movements were economical, his gaze steady and direct, unlike the fleeting, often contemptuous looks of the others. He was a warrior, clearly respected, perhaps feared, but he held himself apart. He did not join the others in the casual cruelties inflicted upon her, the sharp kicks, the harsh words, the deliberate deprivations. He simply was a silent observer. At first, she barely registered this difference. Her world had shrunk to the immediate agony of thirst, hunger, and aching muscles, the constant vigilance required to avoid pain. Hope was a dangerous luxury she could not afford. Despair was a lead weight she dragged through each waking hour. She dreamt of clean water, of familiar faces, of a life that felt impossibly distant, and woke to the stark reality of captivity, the smell of wood smoke and drying meat, the endless, empty sky. But over time, perhaps weeks, perhaps months, the blur of her existence began to resolve into sharper detail. She saw the way other warriors regarded Tall Knife, a mix of deference and something else, something less defined, maybe resentment. She saw the solitude he seemed to inhabit even when surrounded by others. And she began to notice the small things, the infinitesimal divergences from the expected pattern of her misery. A skin of water left closer than usual. A bundle of wood she had struggled with suddenly lighter. A moment when she stumbled, and his gaze, distant yet clear, met hers across the camp, holding no judgment, only witness. These instances were not acts of kindness, not yet. They were simply omissions of cruelty, or perhaps a quiet acknowledgement of her presence as something other than a burden or an object of scorn. It was a fragile thread in the suffocating weave of her days, barely perceptible, easily dismissed as coincidence. Yet, in the vacuum of her isolation, it was something. It was the first hairline crack in the wall of her despair, allowing a sliver of the outside world, a possibility she dared not name. The world outside the small orbit of her tasks was harsh and unforgiving. The wind whipped across the plains, carrying sand that stung her eyes and dried her throat. Summers were a furnace. Winters promised a biting cold she knew in her bones would be merciless. She had seen the casual brutality meted out to animals, the indifference to suffering. She knew her own life held little value here, less than a good horse, perhaps equal to a sturdy hide. This knowledge was a cold, constant companion. It was the backdrop against which the subtle anomaly of Tall Knife's presence began to stand out, like a single, enduring star in a storm-racked sky. She watched him from the periphery of her vision, a silent study in the dynamics of this alien world, trying to understand the rules, the dangers, and the single, still point within it that seemed to exist outside the general current of antagonism towards her. He was an enigma, a figure of quiet strength in a place that valued overt power, and her survival might, impossibly, depend on deciphering him. Her days were a monotonous cycle of dawn to dusk labor, punctuated by meager meals and nights spent huddled under thin blankets, listening to the sounds of the camp and the vast, empty silence beyond. The women of the tribe treated her with a mixture of disdain and indifference, sometimes assigning her the most arduous tasks, sometimes ignoring her completely. The children, however, were bolder, their curiosity untempered by adult reserve. They would sometimes gather to stare, pointing and whispering in their rapid language, their eyes wide and uncomprehending of her plight. Sometimes, their games would spill over and involve her, a fleeting, confusing moment where she was briefly part of their world before an adult's sharp word or glare reminded them, and her, of her place. Tall Knife remained a distant figure. He participated in hunts, joined the councils of the warriors, his voice low and measured when he spoke. He was a presence, felt rather than seen clearly, often at the edges of her perception. She learned the rhythm of his days, when he left the camp and when he returned, the way he cared for his horses and weapons with meticulous attention. She saw that while he was respected, there was a reserve around him, a space that others did not easily cross. He seemed to carry a burden, a quiet sadness that mirrored her own, yet was entirely separate. It was a shared solitude, a parallel existence within the crowded chaos of the camp. One evening, the men returned from a raid, spirits high, their voices loud with victory. Captives were brought in, faces pale with terror, their clothes torn. Alara watched from the shadows, a wave of nausea washing over her. The sight was a chilling reflection of her own arrival, a stark reminder of the precariousness of her situation. The warriors were boisterous, their treatment of the new captives rough and cruel. As the revelry grew, fueled by drink, the atmosphere turned ugly. A group of younger warriors, emboldened by the mood and perhaps by drink, turned their attention to Alara. They had often subjected her to mocking words and shoves, but this felt different. Their eyes held a predatory gleam, their movements were deliberate. Fear, sharp and cold, lanced through her. She backed away instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. Just as one of them reached for her, a shadow fell over the scene. Tall Knife stood there, silent, his arms crossed. He did not speak, did not draw a weapon. His presence alone was a challenge. The warriors faltered, their drunken bravado meeting the unyielding stillness of his gaze. The air crackled with tension, thick and heavy. The warrior who had reached for her snarled something in their language, defiance warring with uncertainty in his eyes. Tall Knife's gaze did not waver. It was a silent communication, a line drawn in the dust. Slowly, reluctantly, the group dispersed, muttering curses under their breath as they retreated back towards the firelight. Alara remained frozen, trembling, watching Tall Knife. He held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. There was no pity, no expectation of gratitude, only that same quiet, unwavering regard. It was the first time he had directly intervened, the first explicit sign that he saw her not just as a captive, but as something worthy of his silent protection. It was not a gesture of affection, but of defiance, defiance against the prevailing cruelty, defiance against the easy path. In that moment, he stepped out of the periphery and into the center of her awareness, a solitary bulwark against the storm. And in his quiet strength, she saw not rescue, but a reflection of a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The intervention changed things. It solidified Tall Knife's position relative to her, marking her as somehow under his unspoken protection, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the others. While some avoided her more overtly cruel comrades now, others regarded her with increased suspicion, and Tall Knife with a simmering resentment. There was friction in the air, a tension that tightened the knot of fear in Alara's stomach. She was no longer just a captive. She was a point of contention, a symbol of Tall Knife's difference, a difference that was clearly not universally accepted within the tribe. The chief, a stern man named Iron Bear, observed these dynamics with a hawk-like gaze. He was an aging leader, his authority absolute but perhaps weary. Tall Knife was one of his most respected warriors, known for his skill in battle and his wisdom in council, yet there was a persistent undercurrent of disapproval from some of the other prominent men, particularly a younger, ambitious warrior named Swift Hawk, who seemed to resent Tall Knife's quiet influence and his unconventional ways. Swift Hawk was bold, aggressive, and embodied the brutal efficiency the tribe valued. He was among those who had targeted Alara that evening, and he did not forget the humiliation of being turned away by Tall Knife's silent stand. The resentment festered. Subtle acts of sabotage were directed at Tall Knife. A saddle strap loosened, a water skin punctured. He faced it all with his customary stoicism, his resolve seemingly unbreakable. Alara watched this silent war unfold, understanding instinctively that her presence was the catalyst, the vulnerability that Swift Hawk sought to exploit. She felt a terrible burden, an unwanted weight on the shoulders of the man who had, through no word or promise, taken responsibility for her safety. Her fear began to mingle with a fierce, protective instinct of her own, a silent defiance that mirrored his. She could not fight with weapons, but she could fight with her will, with her quiet endurance, with her refusal to break. She would not be the cause of his undoing. One cold, blustery morning, a tribal council was called. Alara was summoned, made to stand in the center of the circle while the men debated her fate. Iron Bear presided, his face unreadable. Swift Hawk spoke first, his voice loud and accusatory. He spoke of her as a drain on resources, a potential spy, a foreign presence that disrupted the harmony of the camp. He argued she should be traded or worse, eliminated, for the good of the tribe. Other voices rose in agreement, their words sharp and unforgiving. Alara stood straight, her chin lifted, meeting their hostile gazes not with defiance, but with a quiet dignity she hadn't known she possessed. She understood enough of their language now to grasp the terrifying essence of their words, the cold calculus of their decision. Then Tall Knife spoke. His voice was low, but it cut through the air like his namesake blade. He did not argue for her release, knowing it was impossible. Instead, he spoke of her resilience, her willingness to work, her lack of trouble. He did not elevate her status, but simply stated facts, presenting her not as a valuable asset, but as a presence that, under his watch, posed no threat. He claimed responsibility for her, a heavy pronouncement that drew sharp intakes of breath from some and scowls from others, Swift Hawk most prominent among them. He was putting his own standing, perhaps his life, on the line for a foreign captive. It was an unprecedented act. Swift Hawk countered, his voice dripping with scorn. He questioned Tall Knife's judgment, his motives, even his loyalty. The words were a direct challenge, thinly veiled accusations of weakness or something darker. The council waited, the air thick with anticipation. Tall Knife's face remained impassive, but his eyes, when they met Swift Hawk's, held a dangerous light. He did not respond to the taunts. He simply stated his claim again, his voice firm and final. Iron Bear considered for a long moment, his gaze shifting between the two warriors. The tribe valued strength but also a certain balance, a respect for the established order, even when challenged subtly. Tall Knife was tested, his conviction laid bare for all to see. The chief finally spoke, his voice resonating with authority. He did not explicitly side with Tall Knife, but he accepted his claim of responsibility. Alara was to remain under Tall Knife's watch. The matter was settled, for now. As the council dispersed, Swift Hawk shot Tall Knife a look of pure hatred before stalking away. Alara remained standing, her legs trembling, her heart aching with a complex mix of fear, relief, and a burgeoning sense of awe. Tall Knife had faced down not just a rival, but the collective judgment of his peers for her sake. He had chosen a difficult path, one that set him further apart from his own people, and he had chosen it silently, decisively, without seeking anything in return. In that tense council circle, their fates had become inextricably linked, bound by his quiet courage and her unwilling presence. The days that followed were marked by a fragile, unspoken truce. Swift Hawk and his allies did not back down entirely, their resentment a palpable weight in the camp. But Iron Bear's decision, backed by Tall Knife's unwavering stance, had temporarily shifted the balance. Alara found herself moved to a small, separate structure near Tall Knife's teepee, a clear demarcation of her new status under his protection. It was not freedom, but it was a different kind of captivity, one infused with the quiet tension of their shared isolation. Their interaction remained minimal, defined by necessity and silent understanding. He brought her food and water, assigned her tasks that kept her busy but were less arduous than before. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in clipped, functional phrases in the Comanche tongue, enough for her to understand the immediate command. She, in turn, responded with nods and simple gestures, her own tongue still clumsy with their words. Yet, a deeper communication began to unfold between them, carried in exchanged glances, shared silences, the subtle shifts in body language. She learned to read the warnings in the set of his jaw, the weariness in his eyes after a long hunt, the rare, almost imperceptible moments of stillness when he seemed lost in thought. He, she sensed, was watching her as well, observing her quiet diligence, her resilience, the way she carried herself not with servility, but with a quiet, unyielding dignity. There were nights when the wind howled, carrying the sounds of the plains and the distant, unsettling cries of animals. On those nights, fear would sometimes claw at her, the vastness of her isolation pressing down. She would huddle in her corner, and sometimes she would see his shadow pass by her entrance, a silent patrol, a reassurance that he was near. It was not affection, not romance. It was something forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability and defiance. It was a bond of mutual respect, of two solitary figures finding a precarious foothold in a world that threatened to consume them both. Her hands, though still calloused, grew steadier. Her body, though lean, gained a wiry strength. The constant knot of fear in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a quiet resolve. She was still a captive, still a stranger, but she was no longer solely defined by her powerlessness. She had endured, she had observed, and she had found an unlikely ally in the most unexpected of places. Tall Knife had not saved her in the way she might once have dreamed of rescue, but he had given her something equally vital, the space to survive on her own terms, to find her own strength. The plains remained vast and indifferent, the future uncertain. The resentment towards Tall Knife and towards her had not vanished, merely retreated into the shadows. There would be future challenges, future dangers. But as Alara looked out at the endless horizon, the same horizon that had once symbolized her despair, she saw it now not as an empty void, but as a path. A difficult, dangerous path shared with a man of quiet integrity, a man who had chosen to stand against the tide. Her journey from a broken captive to a woman reclaiming her spirit had not ended. It had simply entered a new, precarious chapter. She had been stripped bare, but in the process, she had discovered the bedrock of her own resilience. And beside her, walking a parallel, silent path, was the warrior who had dared to see her, and in doing so had allowed her to see herself anew.